All right, everyone, let's begin. We are going to look at the Gospels today, and particularly focus on John's Gospel. But I want to say something in general about all the Gospels to begin with. So we'll start off with a broad discussion of the Gospels before turning to one in particular, namely John's Gospel. And I'll get to that in a minute. The Gospels, I think, are a rather unique literary form. They're often described as biographies because they are written about Jesus. He is the obvious point of interest, person of interest. It's about his life and about his death. But they're like no other biographies that have ever been written, not even the death of Ivan Illich, which I am teaching concurrently with first year students, where it begins with the death of the character, and then the rest of the novella is backtracking how he got to that point. The gospel accounts do deal with Jesus' death for more than half of their accounts. So for a biography, it's a strange form of biography if that's the case. And also in 2 of the 4, there's no discussion of the birth of the character. In 2 of the 4, there's no discussion of, there's no genealogy. So Matthew has a genealogy. So does Luke. Matthew begins with the genealogy. Luke puts it in chapter 3 after the birth narrative, which is the most extensive of the birth narratives. Mark skips the birth narrative. John goes back to the creation of the entire cosmos. So it goes before anything was created. So there's a vast difference between the Gospels on those counts. There's also, in terms of a biography, there's very little in the Gospels about his years between the age of 2 and 30. So we find about his birth, we hear a bit about his parents taking him to the land of Egypt to escape the closing arm of the Roman Empire that's threatening to take his life. And then we hear very little bit. We hear about his bar mitzvah. So when he's 12, he reads from the scroll. We hear about that. But aside from that, nothing. So there's a silence over a significant portion of his life, which for a biography is, again, not just unusual, it's extraordinary. It wouldn't fit any biography. And so it doesn't really fit the genre of biography. Although since it's about one character, you would probably call it a biography if you had to call it by one thing. But it doesn't really fit that. The other thing I would say about it is that let me think about this. In terms of the subject matter, Jesus is the hero of the story. Right? It's a heroic tale of sorts. But as a heroic figure, he doesn't fit the expectations of the hero, at least in the classical sense, or even those that come thereafter, because he's not an aristocrat. He's not of the, he may be from the line of David, he may be the king, but he's not acknowledged as a king. And he doesn't act like a king, at least in terms of what he demands from his earthly subjects, in terms of his interaction with them. And he acts, in fact, like a servant. So, and those that are his immediate followers, furthermore, from the lowest stations in life, in many ways, even to the point of being enemies of his people, such as the tax collector, who was a traitor working for the Roman Empire. And he calls fishermen and so forth. So these are not, he's not calling people from amongst the religious elite or the political elite or the cultural elite. He's calling them from what would historically be considered the lower elements of society. So there's an inversion of our understanding of heroism in the main character of Jesus and his followers. So with that, it starts to, just from a literary perspective, it's messing with our conceptual framework. So as I said to you, tragedies deal with aristocrats and people who are superior to us. Comedies, the opposite. They're from the working classes. We laugh at them. This is dealing with heroes that are commoners. And so there's an inversion of expectations in that, which now probably doesn't strike us so much because we live in an age where equality is promoted at all costs of a particular sort, and so we don't notice the flattening out of the cultural expectations of the day. And furthermore, he speaks to women, and further still, the earliest witnesses to his resurrection are also women. And in the eyes of his contemporaries, the testimony of women is not as credible as that of men. So these are all sorts of overturning of conventions, even in terms of literary conventions, but certainly cultural ones, that make it a unique feature. And so it's a unique genre. But Ryken says, and I think there's some substance to this as well, having said all that, the unique nature is somewhat overstated because, and he says it's better rather than calling them unique to say that they're encyclopedic. So they encompass all manner of genres. So they have an epic quality and a comic quality and a tragic quality, and there's lyric in it, and there's parable in it, and there's something of the miracle stories in it. So all manner of features, and they're all thrown together in this genre that we call gospel, which is not referring to the literary features, but rather to the substance of the story being told, which is that it's good news. It's the evangelion, right? So it is, he says, it is the precise combination of literary elements that converge in the Gospels that is without precise parallel outside the Bible. That's end quote 371. So it's this combination that makes it a unique. So it's not that it's unique as in it has no parallel, it's that it has parallel in all manner of different genres, and then throws them all together. So it's an encyclopedic form. It's the greatest literary form there is. You'll remember that in the course on Milton, we talked about how Milton spent his early years mastering different genres in preparation for writing the epic, which he thought was the greatest of all literary genres. To some degree, the Gospels supersede the epic in that. Now, the epic includes a variety of genres, but this is more epic than the epics. So just a list of the genres represented, and this is from Ryken, and I think it's pretty comprehensive. So there's historical narrative. We see that right away. There's parable. I'll talk about parables next class. Take a whole class to talk about parable. There is drama or dialogue. There is sermon or oration. It's a particular type of speech. There are proverbs. There's biography. There is an element of diary or even journal in it. There's the tragedy I mentioned. There's the comedy. There is satire. Remember Jesus as satirist. I talked about Jesus as the satirist. That's an element of it as well. And there's even poetry. So the prologue to John's Gospel. There's also narrative and discourse, and they are equally emphasized. So you can't say it's any one of these things. It seems to have elements of all these different genres, and it blends them in a way that, as I say, overturns expectations of heroism as well. And well, they might, not only because they draw upon the common people, and Jesus appears to the crowds, and the crowds follow him, but he appears and they're all stunned by his teaching because they've never heard anyone with the authority that he has, and yet he comes from Nazareth, and whoever has ever come from Nazareth of any repute, and he, in the end, is crucified, which is the worst imaginable form of death in the ancient world. So it's hardly fitting any expectations of heroism, and yet there's no doubt that Jesus is not only the hero of the story, but the model to be followed by his followers as well, which is part of the mark of heroism in the ancient world. It's not only that the character is great, we are to act like the character. It's part of paideia, which I talked about in some of my courses. The form of mimesis, we represent reality, and the reality of the hero is one that we seek to imitate ourselves. So all of those things make the Gospels unique, but unique not in the sense of original without precedent, but unique in the sense of the blending of the various genres. That is what makes them unique. And there's never been any other writing like them, and before and nor subsequently, I cannot think of another that even approaches doing the same things. So then the question, this is Ryken's question, I think it's a good one. How literary are the Gospels? Because Christians who are wary of the liberal theological tendency to dispute the miraculous in the stories are wary of admitting that they are literary, because to admit they're literary will be to admit figurative language, and with figurative language to dispute the historical aspects of the accounts, right? So as a consequence, I think the pushback's too strong, and they were basically ignoring or then misreading the literary nature of the Gospels. So that's my concern. That's how I always read the Gospels, is I could see the literary features. I thought, can't you have it both ways? Can't it have literary features and be talking about a historical event? There's no doubting that the Gospel writers are not writing myths. They are talking about a historical figure. Luke makes that really plain. Speaking as a historian, the doctor. But all of the Gospel writers are clearly, so Matthew's Gospel begins with the genealogy. So the genealogy is a historical genre. It's tracing generations and so forth. And Luke likewise. So again, plainly sees it as a figure in history. But at the same time, we have all of these other literary genres which are plainly a part of the narrative, and I think if you don't account for that, then you're ignoring the richness and the power of God's written word. So that's part of my burden here, is to try and bring that out. So one of the literary features is that there are vivid details that appeal to the imagination. And the same vivid details provoke the reader to recreate those experiences. So when, not just Christians, but when anyone reads the Gospels, they're struck by their power and by the beauty of Jesus himself and his moral character. You cannot be impressed, cannot but be impressed by the character of Jesus. Even people who are not Christians will admire Jesus' ethic of turning the other cheek, of refusing to respond to evil with evil, of blessing his enemies. So this teaching ministry, but even his conduct and the integrity. So he says this and he acts in total consonance with his teaching. There's no breach in his character. His words and his actions are the same. And that is striking. So it's so striking that everyone is struck by it. Literally everyone is struck by it. So, and that appeals to the imagination as well. So his words are powerful, and his actions are a reflection of his words. And so again, go back to what we said about the nature of the word being the davar, the word, and then the event. Jesus, the word of God, is also the event of God. His actions are an outflowing of his nature. And once again, he's also the logos of God. He's the inner principle of all things. And everything seems connected to him in a deep, profound way that we can't really get to the bottom of. although his parables try to do it, and remain just as powerful as stories as anything you'll ever read. Jesus' parables are extraordinary, and they're so simple. There's also the highly artistic form. So there are stories with clear patterning in them, like so clear that they can't be ignored. But as soon as you start seeing the patterns, it becomes so obviously patterned and so obviously artistic that somebody will immediately say, we can't possibly know what really happened here, because it's been so consciously presented by the writer. And so then the Jesus seminar will come along and say, well, yes, but we don't know what has happened here, actually. So there's an artistic representation here for sure. But Jesus himself didn't write these, first of all. It was his disciples. And then the aging of the gospel accounts becomes one of the issues. And there's been a big pushback against the historical critical estimation that the Gospels were written several centuries, or at least a couple hundred years after Jesus' death. There's been a pushback in the timeline for that, so that at least many scholars, and certainly many evangelical scholars, will think that the Gospels were written in Jesus' lifetime, or at least the lifetime of his disciples. Not Jesus' own lifetime, but the lifetime of his disciples. At which point there were eyewitnesses that would have contradicted them, so that becomes an important point. But that's not a literary point so much. That's more of an issue of credibility as a historical document. And since part of it is historical, you have to do that, I think. So there's a highly patterned form. So there's the pattern, there's the unity, there's the balance, the symmetry. He uses foils. So there's good guys and bad guys. There are two brothers. There's a good king, or there's a bad king. There's a good teacher, there's a bad teacher. Right, so these foils are often presented in stories. There's repetition, there's dramatic foreshadowing, there's a lot of echoes. Or even the conscious patterning. Let's take Matthew's gospel here. I mentioned this already, but let's just talk about this. Matthew's genealogy. Genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of David, the son of Abraham. There is a 3 times 14 names. So there are a pattern of 14 names, and each of 3 successive, what we would call paragraphs now, which is a highly patterned way of presenting history. Not every name is in there that is in there. There ought to be other names in the genealogy. So it hasn't named everyone in there, but it's named 3 times 14 in order to show a pattern. And the pattern would be not just 3 times 14, but 3 times 7 times 2. Because 7 is the number of earthly completeness, and to repeat it twice is to suggest there's it's imminent. It's going to happen, just like when something's said and it's said again. And now it's happened over 3 generations. So there's Abraham, and then there's David, and then after the deportation to Babylon, then 3 more. So that is a clearly artificial genealogy. When I say artificial, it has artifice. Conspicuous artistry is involved in it. And in that, and people will note this as well, and this is really interesting, there are a lot of women mentioned in the genealogy. And the women that are mentioned, these on the other hand, are part of the artifice, but they seem in almost in contradiction to it. Because we have Rahab mentioned, and we have also, where is she? By Tamar. We've got Tamar, we have Ruth, we have Rahab. There'll be one more. There will be the wife of Uriah. Interesting, so he's not even going to call her by name. He's going to demonstrate that he doesn't have a proper relation, David. It's the wife of another man, and yet And then finally we'll come to Mary. So we have 5 women, all of them scandalous, or apparent breaches in the ordering, the conscious ordering of things. And yet these women were all means by which God's plan and pattern and order was revealed. So there's the 3 times 14, which is a very strict logical pattern, fits with the biblical idea, and yet then there are breaches in that ordering, and the apparent contradictions are actually also providential. Do you see what I mean there? Like, because these are all scandalous. Tamar was raped. Ruth is from a people opposed to God. Rahab's a prostitute. Uriah's wife is obviously Uriah's wife. So this is an adulterous relationship, which led to Solomon's birth and so forth. And now finally we have this woman by the name of Mary who's had a child out of wedlock. And there's a connection point being sown there as well. So there are the 3 times 14, and there are these 5 women who seem to be ways for human beings to thwart God's plan. Well, the 5th of the 5 is a way of perfectly fulfilling God's original plan of the seed of the woman, back in Genesis 3, verse 14, right? But here it's, if it weren't clear before that, all the generations from Abraham to David were 14 generations, from David to the deportation to Babylon, 14 generations, and from the deportation of Babylon to the Christ, 14 generations. And this is, finally, this is Joseph, the husband of Mary. But he's not the father of Jesus. So again, these breaches in the natural order of things, which nonetheless are ways in which God can and has worked. So his ways are not human ways. He has not relied on human beings. So that's part of the artistry brings that out. I think that's just very, very interesting. Now, the primary form of the Gospels is narrative, just like the rest of the Bible. Narrative is still the primary form. It's not the discourses of Jesus, which are teaching. It's not the sayings of Jesus. It's narrative. And the stories that are told are episodic, as in it's apparently disconnected little bits of story. So you get this narrative, and then there's a gap, and then there's another narrative, and then there's a gap, and the connection between the little narrative chunks is not immediately obvious, or at least we're not given what the connection is. It's for the reader to piece it together. And sometimes, and this is what the historicist critics always struggle with, in some Gospels, this account is told earlier and this one later, and they say, but if it's a historical event, it will be this happened, then this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened. And if that's the case, why does this account differ with that account? And then what they are ignoring is that from a literary perspective, in order to produce a certain effect and to make a point, authors will pull things out of narrative sequence in order to make a theological point or have a literary effect. It doesn't bother me, but it does bother those who are burdened with the idea that it is a sort of reporting event in which there are eyewitnesses standing there, and then this happened, and then this story. But anyway, Adam, did you want to say something?
No.
Okay. Sorry, I'm really struggling with the cold here today. So narrative is the primary form, and the stories are episodic rather than unified. So that's what I mean by episodic then. In the same way that it's not exactly the same, but in the way the Knights of the Round Table, the stories of the different knights are told under the tales of King Arthur and his knights. There'll be an episode related to Sir Gawain and one related to this, and they're all related in some way, but the relation is not made without, there are gaps between them. Yes?
Professor, could I just make a comment on what you said earlier about the penchant of these modern critics to dismiss the historicity of an account because of the miraculous?
Yes.
I keep thinking of what Aslan said in The Magician's Nephew.
Yeah, quote
O
Aslan.
sons of Adam and daughters of Eve, how well you hide yourselves from all that would do you good.
Yeah, right. And there is an element of, so this is the problem with historical method, is it presents things in historical sequencing, and the effect of that, so this is the Whig view of history. The Whig view of history is that history runs in an sort of a march of progress up to the present. And the present time is the most advanced of all. So it's the evolutionary narrative. So the modern view of evolution is not possible without historicism. So the idea of progressive evolution, which we get in modern biology, that comes from the idea that there's an advance and a human progress that happens throughout the course of history. That's the Whig view of history that then gets applied to biology. I don't think it doesn't happen out of sequence. First, the view of history has to happen, and then the view of biology follows on its heels. And so there's a reading of the Gospels that if it's calling itself historical, then it has to be amenable to our notions of history. And it can't, and it's going to have to do that absolutely then. So it's applying a methodology and a view of history which is antithetical to the way the stories themselves are being told. That's that's the problem. The one problem is it cuts out the miraculous, because miraculous events are impossible to authenticate. You simply have to accept that they are. Now, if they're written in the form of fantasy or myth, then you could account for it. But these are blended with a clearly historical account. There are miraculous events being told within the broader structure of a historical event. And that's what they find troubling, is this mixture. They want pure genre. It's pure history, or it's pure myth. And so it pushes one way or the other. So some will say, in order to defend the truth of the account, we're going to insist on it's pure history. And then I think, well, then what do you do with the miraculous? Or it's pure myth, well, then what do you do with the history? So you have to keep and preserve both, I think, in order to account for what we're reading there. And I don't think that that's particularly problematic, as long as you don't have presuppositions which preclude the possibility of miracle, as you said. So if you, from the outset, say it's impossible for there to be miracles, now let's just look at these accounts and take them as they are, well, you're never going to see that a miracle has happened. You can't. It must be something else. And then it'll be a figure for something. What it's a figure for, I've never been able to figure out. As I've said to you, whenever liberal critics or historians talk about figures of speech, what they mean is they don't know what to do with it, other than to say it doesn't fit the historical genre. In which case I say that's true, but that's not particularly helpful. So that's the challenge, is that there's again, that historical approach which insists that we are going to be able to look to the past, and with romantic hermeneutics, we'll say that we can know as well, if not better, than the authors themselves about the events that they described. That's the view of the modern theologian. And we'll get that perspective by recovering the context in which they wrote, and we'll be distanced by time, and we won't have the prejudices of the same authors. So we won't think like first century Jews, and we'll be able to see their prejudices, and so we'll know better than them because we won't have their blind spots. That's what the modern historian thinks, because we don't have blind spots, right? I mean, the irony is really heavy. Nobody has blind spots. If they knew they had blind spots, they wouldn't be blind to them, right? The heavy irony, that accusing others of blind spots and saying that you don't have any. I've talked about this a few times here. The modern view is to eradicate prejudice, that is, biases, conscious biases that we have towards the text, to get rid of all those, believing that that removes all the blind spots. And all it does, to my mind, is it makes you totally blind. You can't see anything. And you can never learn anything, because all you're doing is trying to endorse or to support the view that you had at the outset, which is you knew better than the people of Jesus' day. And that means Jesus as well. We know better. So, they're episodic rather than unified, and the apparent randomness of the events in the Gospels, it appears random, there's no doubt about that. The more you study them, the more it makes a sort of sense, but not to the point where you could ever reorder them and come up with a better portrait than they present, or would not lose something by rearranging them. And the outcome of this apparently random ordering of episodes is to create a composite portrait of Jesus in manifold roles. So sometimes he's a teacher, sometimes he's a miracle worker, sometimes he's a dutiful son, sometimes he's a brave leader, sometimes he's a suffering servant, sometimes he is a traitor to his own people, like he'll go into the lands of the Samaritans and so forth. Sometimes he is a brave individual who will stand in the face of power and authority and not flinch. But at all points, he goes beyond any human action that we could ever imagine. So a man being crucified on the cross, who asks his Father to forgive them, for they know not what they do. Who knows his disciples are going to betray him, predicts it, they do it, and yet forgives them and reinstates them. Who washes his disciples' feet. I mean, all of those things make Jesus a human character like no other. Even without the miracles, have you ever met a man like this? And the answer is no. So again, even the people that dispute the miracles have always said, here is the perfect man. And if ever there was a man who is God, it would be Jesus, because this is the perfect man. That's what they mean by it. So there is a unity in the episodes that comes not from the unified narrative, but rather from the portrait of Jesus that arises out of that. And with that, with the four gospel accounts, there is a unity within these four accounts. And the unity resides in the person of Jesus, the hero. It should be said that the accounts are roughly chronological. So it's not like the Quran. The Bible in general, and certainly this here, Jesus is born at the beginning, and he dies at the end, and is resurrected, and so forth. So it's roughly chronological. But the Gospels are structured not on historical chronology, but rather the principle of memory. And there are recurrent type scenes. Now, type scenes, have I talked about type scenes yet here? I'm not sure I have. So my former colleague Keith Bodner, who's now out in Crandall University, writes about type scenes a lot in the Old Testament. Type scenes are scenes that recur throughout Scripture, and there are certain expectations that come along with it. So for the woman at the well, like Jesus meets a woman at the well, right? And Keith will emphasize what anybody who's read the Bible sufficiently carefully will note. There's a lot of meeting of men with women at wells in the Bible, so much so that you start to say, this is not just a random occurrence. Now, it would happen there that you would, a well is a place where people go to get water, because if you get you're in the desert, you have to go to the well to get it. But the meeting of a man and a woman there has certain overtones. Historically, this is where men meet their wives. And so the woman at the well is hanging around the well, and she meets Jesus. So there's a little bit of tension there in the scene, even before anyone speaks. Jesus is meeting a woman at the well, and what's going on here? Because think of a precedent for this. Where is the first instance of a woman at a well that you can think of in Genesis?
Is it looking for Isaac's wife?
Yep. Yep. And he meets a woman there, right? And there's been clear instructions have been given for what is to be said and how you will know it's the right woman and so forth. And it's going to be one of my tribe, and you're going to say this, and if she says this, you said it. So there's an expectation. The bride meets the bride, or at least somebody on behalf of the bridegroom's party meets the bride at the well. Okay, so now you have a woman at the well. Well, so there is I don't want to say a sexual tension there, but there's an element of that there. And the woman hanging around the well, what's she doing hanging around the well? As it turns out, furthermore, she happens to have had 5 husbands. So now we don't just have a potential wife, we have an adulterous woman. Now that adulterous woman is not the same woman, but there's also a woman caught in adultery, right? And there may be a parallel being drawn between those 2 women. They're not actually the same individual, but there's a talk about that. Well, that is part of the type scene there. Those type scenes come out of this as well. So whenever you get stories about kings and peoples, those are sort of type scenes as well, because we've seen them throughout the Old Testament. They've recurred. So these works of literature create their own consistent world, and the details have already been established almost in the Old Testament. So you almost need to see the Gospels as regularly interacting with Old Testament texts. Sometimes they quote them, which will, nobody will dispute then that they're relating to that. But even when they're not quoting the Old Testament, they're alluding to events in the Old Testament, and the reader is supposed to think of those things and what's happening here. So that's a unity that is not only within the Gospels, but the unity within the whole of the Bible, which is why I say that the Bible itself, presenting it as one book, is not only a technological marvel, it's saying something about the unity of the message there. Not just theologically, but in a literary fashion. And I don't think enough work's been done on that. Talk about the literary unity of the whole Bible. That would be an interesting subject. How do the Gospels, which unite so many literary genres, how do they unite the themes and type scenes and whatever that have arisen out of the Old Testament? But out of that unity, the main unity is in the portrait of Jesus himself. So when we say a portrait of Jesus, what sort of portrait? Is it a photograph? By the way, Jesus is not, I said this before, Jesus is not described anywhere, actually. We have no physical description. No height, no weight, hair, none of that. It's not there at all. There are certain very small things which are going to say something. We know that he's a boy. We know that he was circumcised. You can't get much of a portrait from that, as my colleague Victor Shepard says. But aside from that, very little. Hair length? No. I mean, if you look at the Dutch painters, you'd think that he had long hair and blue eyes. He looked like a bit like a hippie, or looked like a Dutchman. If you look at the paintings from the Italian Renaissance, he looks like an Italian. Right? But if you look at artistic depictions from other cultures, likewise. And all of them are possible because really we have no idea what he looks like. And what's further being said is that doesn't matter, I think. I think that doesn't matter. It's an irrelevant point. Or more to the point, it's as much as we want to know what he looks like, that is not of chief importance. And the point of the Gospels is to bring out what is of chief importance. So again, it doesn't tell us about 30 years of his life, because that, although I'm sure would be fascinating, is not of chief importance. So everything that is really essential has been told there, and nothing else. So it's not a photograph, so it's certainly not an exact portrait, because there are too many gaps. Is it a painting? Well, that would, and in a sense you could see more of a painting, because there's been a selection of details in the portraits. The four Gospels each have a little bit of a different perspective in the way they arrange the stories, in whether they decide to include the birth narrative, and then those would suggest more like an artistic portrait. So we're going to look at the different colors of light and shade and context and so forth. The suggestion of Reichen is that they are selective narratives meant for a purpose, and he says that they're like a slow motion replay. He's grasping at analogies. How do we describe this? And furthermore, there are four of them, so it's not any one. All four are, God has given us four Gospels. Why? And what's the effect? In terms of the style of the literature, it is, like all scripture, laconic. It's brief in its description. Who would be the best preacher you've ever heard? Jesus. Do we have anything like a whole sermon from Jesus in this? We have a longer sermon from Stephen than we do from Jesus. I find that extraordinary. It's extraordinary. Why would we not have a sermon from Jesus? Well, we do. It's the Sermon on the Mount. But that's a funny old sermon, right? Have you ever heard a sermon like that? It's not told in the style of what we would call a sermon. It's called the Sermon on the Mount. That's the editor's description of it. But you'll never have heard a sermon like it, and you never will. And we have nothing like, as I say, Stephen's long sermon in Acts. So there's a laconic style. There are self-contained episodes. They are very coherent in themselves, but then they put alongside another episode that the relation between one episode and the next is not immediately obvious. So for example, in the story of the prodigal son, it's preceded by the lost coin. So you have a lost coin, a lost son, and there's another lost thing, a lost sheep. Three things that are lost, and they're put one after the next. How do they relate? Well, they're all related to something that's lost. And they're all related to the importance of finding the thing that's lost, and how God, who's represented by various figures, will do anything to find that lost thing. So they're united in that purpose, but a coin and a sheep and a boy or boys don't seem to be connected in any way. Yes?
In that culture, they would all technically be they would all belong to father, ownership. The coins belong to the father. Sheep would be the father's flock, and the son is his father's son.
His father's son, but not something he owns as property. There is inheritance in a sense, but they're not actually something he owns. So there's a dissonance there as well as a parallel. So there's no unity that can be connected between the objects. It's more the unity of the person seeking those things, and rather than the unity in the objects being sought. That's how it appears to me, at any rate. There's also, throughout these episodes, there is a prevailing realism. So the stories are clearly, and we'll get to this when we talk about the parables, the stories are clearly stories. They're not talking about, he doesn't have in mind something he read in the news. You remember that guy? And he's talking and telling a story about somebody that probably never existed. It's fictive, it's purely fictional in that sense. And yet, in that, there is a prevailing realism in it. There's no trouble in believing that the characters being described could actually have lived and talked and done what happened. Just like the parable of the prodigal son there. Other than that the father acts like no Israelite would ever have acted. Because a son that did what his son did would have been disinherited instantly, would never have been welcomed back. He certainly wouldn't have sought it. So there's a lack of realism in that sense. Although it's not realism, it's more, this is a father like no other father you've ever met. But that goes back to this account, right? God's character is being contrasted almost as if all of these fathers, this is the father of the father of the father of the father of, in order to show who the father is really like and what a father ought to be like. That's the point of the fathers. Because look at how these fathers have mistreated women, certain women. So fathers do this, and as good as some of the fathers are, they have not been perfect. But this father is nothing like those. The emphasis on fathers is a way of talking about the father. And the son who glorifies the father and acts in accordance with the father's will, which he repeats, it's saying something about the fatherhood of God. It's not just giving a historical genealogy. You have to see that in a literary way. So there is a prevailing realism, but it's a realism that you will never meet the sort of fathers that are represented in the parable of the prodigal son, other than God himself. This is what fathers ought to be like. And we could actually believe in our heart of hearts that a father wants to be like this. He just never manages to do it. But this father has. There is also an impulse towards dialogue and lots of dramatic stuff. So the engagements between Jesus and the Pharisees, Jesus and the crowd, Jesus and the disciples, all have a strong dramatic flair to them. You can imagine being there and them not understanding what Jesus is saying, who Jesus is, and Jesus saying it, and when he says something, I'm always wondering, how did he say that? Like, what was his tone of voice? Is it because there's an element of, like, when we speak of irony, when we, the audience, know more than the characters themselves know, right? There's a sort of a broader awareness, there's a discrepant awareness. And Jesus, we know, knows more than they do, and yet they're asking him questions, and he flips it around, he asks them questions in the same way we saw in the book of Job. At the end of them putting God in the dock, God as the witness then gets to ask them a few questions. And then, first question he asked Job is, who are you? And he says, I don't know. I don't know. So you can't even answer the most basic question, and yet you're asking me? I don't know. Put in his place. So the brevity, though, and this laconic style, the brevity and the conciseness, it actually increases the difficulty. So that on the surface, these stories are very, very simple. There's no doubt about that. Easy for a child to understand. They immediately relate to it. But beneath the surface, there is a great deal of stuff happening. And so much complexity that people will write books upon books on even one episode. But certainly on all of the parables, there are, I don't know how many books on the parables. And they all seem, I shouldn't say all, and I certainly haven't read them all, but they seem to be picking out something interesting about the text that you never saw before. That's interesting. So the brevity doesn't eliminate the difficulty, it increases it. And that's why it's endlessly fascinating. When I hear a sermon on the Gospels, I always find the story itself intriguing. The sermon isn't necessarily usually so intriguing. Sometimes it is. It depends on what the preacher has put into it and how much he's prayed for what is. But there's something that will strike you afresh. Maybe you've never thought of it, or maybe it's just hitting you anew about the portrait there. Also, and let me say finally, within the Gospels, there are also subtypes, subgenres. I haven't mentioned these yet. So there are Annunciation scenes, which are portrayed in Italian art. Like it's the portrait in Italian art, the Annunciation. You've got Mary there. You got the angel. Or the nativity stories. Those could be looked at on their own. Fascinating. There's also the vocation stories, or the calling. Sometimes it's Jesus' vocation, sometimes it's the disciples' vocation. All sorts of calling stories. Then there's recognition stories, where somebody suddenly who was blind then sees. And that can take various forms. Literally, it can be somebody who's blind and has their sight restored to them. Or it can be like Peter, who is not blind, for the first time seeing who Jesus is. Right? And then actually in that gospel account, really interesting, there's the healing of a blind man. Jesus heals a blind man, and then Jesus asks Peter, "Who do you say I am?" And he says, "You're the Christ." And he says, "Don't tell anyone." This is the strangest thing. It's in the midst of a story where he's healing a blind man. It's the only time, by the way, where Jesus fails to perform a miracle the first time. He has to do it twice. So the first time he touches the man's eyes, I think he does it with mud. He asks him what he sees, and he says, "I see men like trees walking around." And then he does it again, second time, and then he can see fully. And then right in the middle of that story is the story of Peter saying that he is the Christ, and Jesus saying to him, "Don't tell anyone who I am." And I think we're meant to, with that foil of the blind man seeing partially, that's a reference to Peter, who sees partially, "You're the Christ." But he doesn't know what comes after that story, which is that the Son of Man will now have to go and be crucified and be dead and buried and raised. And so, but this will happen, and then Peter rebukes Jesus, and then he is told to get behind him, and he's called Satan. So he's like the man who can partially see, but he doesn't yet know that if he really sees Jesus clearly, he will know that he has to go and be crucified. Right? So it's that parable, or that historical narrative in the midst of the story of the healing of the blind man is really about Peter, and how he doesn't see clearly enough yet that this has to happen. So that's just fascinating. It's a simple story, but in that one unique instance where Jesus doesn't heal somebody, it's making a comment on where Peter stands in relation to him at this point. Remember, he calls Peter. And he says, "You couldn't have seen this without God, but you don't see clearly enough yet." Poor Peter was pretty happy because he got something right for the first time ever. And then it was all taken away from him in the next instant. "You're the Christ." Right. He's like, "Yes, first time." And then he rebukes Jesus for telling him he's going to have to go and die, and then he gets called Satan, and back he goes again. I mean, Peter's a comic figure in the Gospels. This is one of the things that convinced me about the historical accuracy. It's good because the scholarly community historically said that the Gospel accounts were written hundreds of years after the narratives, events told in Jesus' lifetime, hundreds of years afterwards, and they were written from the disciples' perspective in order to give them legitimacy in the community and to prop up their authority. But my question, which now I've read commentators also raise, is then why are the disciples presented as such buffoons? Like, they're always wrong. And not only are they wrong, they're treacherous. Right? Like, nobody who wanted to pump up their own tires would present themselves like such idiots. They wouldn't. And then, furthermore, the people who have legitimacy, the only ones, are the women at the end. That's not going to work either. Right? Not in the context, if you want to historicize, in the context of first century Israel, having women as eyewitnesses, that's not getting much mileage. Unless it's actually a historical account of it, in which case, that's the way it was. and then put that back in with this account of women. It's really interesting. So then you combine the historical with the literary, and you start to get very interesting questions that you can't answer other than by holding to the Christian historical account of this. Then there are also witness stories. You know, who is this man? Some of them are witness accounts. You know, what happened here? There are testimonies and who, what, and why. Why did these things happen? There are encounter stories between Jesus and various people. So Zacchaeus, man so short he had to climb up into a tree. The second shortest man in the Bible. You know who the shortest is? Bildad the Shuhite.
Oh, man.
Yeah, sorry. I'll never do that again. Gosh, everyone's asleep here.
Dad jokes.
It's a dad joke.
Yeah, but I've never heard it before.
No,
so-
I heard it years ago. It's really terrible actually. It's really appalling. Yeah. Well, thank you for that. I appreciate that. Lots of conflict stories. Jesus, the Pharisees, Jesus, the crowd, Jesus, the Romans. Lots of stories of conflict. These are subtypes. Proclamation, pronouncement stories. Jesus John pronouncing who Jesus is. Jesus pronouncing upon the state of Israel or Jerusalem. All manner of miracle stories. These are a subgenre unto themselves. The passion narratives. And then all sorts of hybrids. Forgive me for the Bildad the Shuhite. You probably won't forget it. It's so appallingly corny. That's why I remembered it. So let's go to John. Comments or questions there? Not about Bildad, please. Dad stories. Yeah. Let's look at John's Gospel then. So we've already talked a bit about John's Gospel, and I don't want to spend too much on this. But the dominant pattern of the stories in the Gospels, as I've already said, is narrative or story. But it's only when we read it continuously, and this is why it's really useful to do that, is to read them not just a little bit at a time, but try and read them as one story. So it's really helpful to hear it read on an audio version or to yourself read it aloud. Then you get the whole sweep of the story from the beginning to ending. I think that's necessary. And otherwise, they sit there as episodes which are profound, but the beginning, the middle, and the end of what a story isn't fully obvious there. So they need to be read that way. And then they become something like a short story or almost a novel. But the Gospel of John is the most literary of all of the four, I think. And it's the most unique of the four. The first three are called the synoptic Gospels, right? Because they have the same perspective. Whereas John's Gospel is clearly different from that, as it begins at the beginning, for one thing, rather than at Jesus' birth. But there is a long narrative structure which is built upon various unifying principles. Now, the unifying principles, one of them is that as the plot progresses, John's Gospel, the conflict escalates. So it's building. It's not just he's walking towards Golgotha and Calvary. It's not just that he's walking in that direction and that's the place where he's going to be crucified. The tension between Jesus and those around him builds as the story progresses. It's quite palpable. The hostility towards him. So there's a plot conflict that builds, and there's also a build towards a climax then. So it has this building, like a ladder. He's going up to Jerusalem. He's going up to be crucified. The events begin in places where there's absolutely no conflict whatsoever. So in John 2, where can I go there? His first miracle at the wedding at Cana. No conflict at all. John 3, he goes on to the discourses with Nicodemus. No conflict. Just confusion, but no conflict. Then he goes to the Samaritan woman, and then he goes to the healing of an official's son. No conflict. Then he moves to, there are acts of Jesus that elicit extreme conflict after this. So he heals on the Sabbath. He does it on purpose to create conflict. This is interesting. The loving Jesus created conflict wherever he went. Wherever he went, when he starts revealing who he is. And how those who claim to be his people have gone astray from him, that's when he starts provoking conflict. So it starts off with the healing on the Sabbath, then there's an argument over his claims to be the bread of life, and then there's the controversy at the Feast of Tabernacles, and so on, and it ends in Jesus calling the Pharisees whitewashed sepulchres and so forth, and cursing them. That's conflict, and that's the satire element, right? It's as sharp as can be, and it ends then after he has cursed them with them cursing him, and their curse of him is putting him on the cross. So it is an intensification of conflict. It is a building, and it gets more and more intense as it goes along. Now, the only exception to this pattern, and this is Ryken's point, I think it's a good one, is the cleansing of the temple, and that's interesting. But even there's conflict. The Passover of the Jews was at hand, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. In the temple, he found those who were selling oxen and sheep and pigeons, and the money changers were sitting there. And making a cord of whips, he drove them all out of the temple with the sheep and the oxen. And he poured out the coins of the money changers and overturned their tables. And he told those who sold the pigeons, "Take these things away. Do not make my Father's house a house of trade." Disciple remembers what it was written, "Zeal for your house will consume me." Okay. For those, by the way, who think that Jesus never got angry, because God doesn't get angry, therefore Jesus didn't. He not only was angry in doing this and casting them out, note also he was premeditated in his violence. He made a cord of whips. He sat there and twisted the cords together. And then he went after them. Premeditated violence. How do you like that? There's a context, of course, but the idea that Jesus was never violent seems to be contradicted by this, and it wasn't a fit of anger on the other hand. He intended to do exactly what he did. He knitted, making a whip out of cords, and then he cast them out. So terrific conflict in the midst of this. But this conflict serves the narrative function of foreshadowing what will happen ever after this. So this is the first event. He cleanses the temple, but he is the temple. He throws them out, and they're going to want to push back. So it foreshadows all of the conflict that follows. And ultimately, his cleansing of the temple will succeed when the temple of his body is destroyed and then raised again. Lots of literary types being used there. So here, Jesus initiates the conflict, whereas later on, it's the Jews pushing back against him with far more violence. There's also a principle of expansion followed by constriction. So it expands out, and then it squeezes back in, like a bellows. You know, when it bellows with a fireplace? Pull it out, the air comes in, then push back out. So the account begins with Jesus' relations with a small circle of believers, including John the Baptist, his disciples, his family, his friends. They're all there at this scene here in Cana. He was invited to the wedding with his disciples. His mother's also there, so is his family. From this intimate circle, his public ministry expands throughout Israel then. And huge crowds of people. So moves out. And as the conspiracy to kill Jesus grows, his contacts starts to shrink. The crowds remove themselves. The disciples remove themselves. His family remove themselves. In the end, he's on his own. Everyone leaves him. And in the last week of his life, he does spend time with the disciples. And then likewise, after his resurrection, the small inner circle of friends, but the big crowds are all gone. There's also the conflict between belief and unbelief. That's a persistent theme there. There's also the pattern in the construction of the overall structure within narrative units. So one of the things here, and this is the wedding at Cana is the first illustration, there are 7 signs. Let me talk about that for a minute here. The 7 signs. The word sign matters here in John's Gospel. What is a sign? Well, a sign is something that points you somewhere, right? And it's very important in John's Gospel. It's not referred to in the other Gospels, but in John's Gospel there are 7 signs. And these seem to draw attention to the significance inherent in Jesus' miracles. So they're connected with miraculous events. And the miracles are themselves signs of something. So they're not just a description of a miraculous event, but they symbolize a spiritual reality. That's what the sign is. There's a spiritual reality that's breaking in here that you can't understand. It's like the kingdom of God. And the sign of the kingdom's breaking into the world is evident in this miracle and the other signs that will follow. Now, what do the signs embody? Well, that's what John is trying to answer. One of the very few clear answers to that is that he states that the miracle here manifested his glory. Glory being an attribute of God. And his disciples believed in him. So there's a sign of the glory of God and when they believed in him. Another meaning is implicit in the 6 stone jars here. So there's in verse 6 stone water jars for purification. These are used for the ceremonial rituals of a Jewish wedding. By turning the water into wine, Jesus is announcing through the act of transformation that he'd come to fulfill and also to supersede the Old Testament. Not just fulfill it, because fulfilling is just using the purification things, but now he's doing something with the water. He's making it into wine. I said to you already that wine is interesting because it's a cultural product. It's the product of cultivation and careful cultivation and so forth. And there's a cultural mandate, which is that you're supposed to make what's good and for the sake of purity into something that is not only pure but even better. Jesus takes the water and makes it into wine, which brings joy. Not just don't think drunkenness. Think of it in the positive sense. So it's symbolic of and further symbolic of the Messianic banquet, which so much of the book of Revelation will be about. Right. So the first miracle is at a wedding. Jesus went to weddings regularly. His first miracle was at a wedding. His last appearance in Scripture in the book of Revelation is at a wedding. That's also interesting. One other thing I wanted to, I'm running out of time here, is that there are number patterns. So the number 3 recurs. There are 3 Passovers and 3 other feasts that Jesus attends. There are 3 times witnesses to Christ's messiahship. Late in the narrative, Jesus is condemned 3 times. He speaks 3 times from the cross. He is denied 3 times by Peter. There are 3 stages in Christ's restoration of Peter, so the number seems to have some sort of significance. And you get the same thing with the number 7. So there are the 7 signs that I mentioned, and these include this one that I've just talked about, turning water into wine, but there's also the healing of the official's son, the cure of the paralytic by the pool of Siloam. There's the feeding of the 5,000. There's the walking on the water, which I've always said to you in the Greek does not say water, it says the sea. It says thalassa in Greek. When Jesus walks on the water, he's walking on the sea, and the sea by this point is a symbolic reality that refers to something that opposes God's righteous reign. So when Jesus walks on the sea, he's walking over something that is opposed to God. He's demonstrating his dominion over evil. He's tramping it down under his feet. He's not just walking on any old water. It's called the sea. The healing of the blind man and the raising of Lazarus, these are also 7. There's also 7 statements that begin with the I am, the 7 I am statements. How these relate to the 7 signs is not made clear. We just note that there is a patterning there. I think I ran out of time. Any comments or questions? Barely got into this. Yes, sir.
Just a quick, maybe further explanation. That's pretty cool about the sea. He's demonstrating his authority over evil. Could you just elaborate on that?
Sure, just a little bit. Sure, just a little bit. A sea is a sea, right? God creates seas, and seas in and of themselves are not evil. But as the Old Testament progresses, the sea starts to have the connotations of evil, so that when Moses leads the people of Israel out of Egypt, they cross through the sea. And in the Psalms and elsewhere, the sea is presented as something hostile. And the Jews are afraid of the water, right? They're not afraid of the water, they're afraid of the sea, because the sea symbolizes evil. The other thing that I say to bolster this, and I'll comment more on this when we come to the book of Revelation, in the creation of the new heavens and the new earth, there's no more sea. How come? There's nothing wrong with water. There's nothing wrong with salty water. But it's used even in the book of Revelation in this symbolism of evil. And when he says there's no more evil, it includes the sea in that as a representation of that. And I think that's how it's being used here as well. So he's not just walking on the water, which is, of course, miraculous. It's a miracle with a intention that connects him to the cross, by the way. So all of these signs relate not only to the inbreaking of the kingdom, but relate somehow to how Jesus is going to be who he actually is. It says something about him. So the miracles are of course miraculous, but they reveal something about his character and his mission, just like this one does. Like Messianic banquet as well as cleansing, right? Anyway, we're done. Thank you.